Hi, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Tonight is the open forum, so any live questions that you have, please submit those at any time. Malia will take those questions and pass them on to me. We also take questions that are left over or sent between. You can always send questions, feedback, suggestions to webinar@evoketherapy.com during the week, and we'll put those in the queue for the live questions when we have these live Q&As in between our topic based sessions. So let's get right into the questions that we have that are pre-submitted. And again, Malia will collect and pass on any questions you have. Someone writes, if you do your work while your kids are young, is it possible that you could end up with kids at different numbers of attachment, where it wouldn't make sense to each other later in life? I think a question, first and foremost, there's an idea or a saying that says that no two children have the same parent. And so the process of attachment, the process of relationship, of course, there are some stable features in attachment, like your own healing, your own woundedness, your own awareness and evolution. But there's also something about a systemic idea, which is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And yes, I happen to have had children over a very wide a series of years. My oldest child is 27 years old right now, soon to be 28, and my youngest child is 12, soon to be 13 years old. So that's a pretty broad range of children, of ages for children. But I want to tell you something that for me it's kind of funny and interesting. I have two children, 26 or 27 and 26, and then I have two more children, 18 and 12. And there was obviously a space in between there. And my two older children are the product of my younger years, my earlier years. And then my two older children are a product of my younger years. My two younger children, of course, I had later in life. And I've kind of thought of something. I've kind of realized that I really did correct some of the themes and mistakes that I was making with the older children. I think about this and talk about this all the time. But the punchline is that I made a whole new series of mistakes. I have this theory that if our child bearing and rearing years lasted hundreds of years, that we would make new kinds of mistakes over and over again, with maybe slight improvement over time. And so, as strange as it sounds, the idea is not to get it right or be perfect, but to kind of be human, to realize, like I talk about all the time, that we do dent our children, we do bruise our children, and those dents and those bruises are worthy of exploration and examination. And eventually, as they grow up, those dents and bruises are theirs to cope with, theirs to deal with, theirs to make sense out of. And so I think your answer is, my simple answer to your question is yes. I think as we heal and as we grow, we make different kinds of mistakes and have different kinds of attachments. But I would want to steer away from the notion that we ever get to a point of ending our journey, of arriving. In fact, I think that arriving is probably one of the most dangerous mindsets we can have, because if you've arrived, you have nothing left to learn. Your stuff doesn't stink, if you will, and your children have nowhere to place or put their anger and their frustration. So I think it's a journey, and I always tease and joke that we know we're done with our work when we don't wake up anymore. We're hopefully living and growing and learning and evolving until our last day on earth. I think it's very rare to have a person who's willing to learn and grow and unlearn things past a certain point in life, because I think a lot of us believe or maybe think we should have figured it all out or figured most of it out. So my simple answer is yes. I think there'll be different kinds of attachments as you do your work. I think there'll be overall improvements in your awareness and your ability to hold space with your children. But I would simply warn against the idea that you can get it right, that you can get it perfect. So thank you for the question. Somebody says, what is your criteria for determining when a person is ready to transition to the next step, home, boarding school, etc.? It's a great question. One of the questions that I've answered maybe as many as any, so it's obviously relevant. You're not alone in it. And I always say it's a very complex matrix, right? It's a combination of where they started, what are the family and situations at home in your community, how old are they, where you're at in your work, and I don't think there's a simple way to define when the right time is. The right time is when you decide for them to leave. I've been coaching people. In fact, in the last couple of intensives, we've had discussions with parents who have been grappling with this very same question. And the language that we've come up with in responding to children who are eager to get home, who want to get home, who want to have some objective criteria set for when they're coming home. The kind of coaching that we've come up with together is for parents to say, I'm working as hard as I can to be ready for you to come home. Some parents worry that might anger or frustrate children because it sounds like the parent is needing to do the work. And if it's the parent's work that needs to get done, why is the child being, quote, punished, unquote, because of the parent's lack of work? And my first answer is that's because that's life. The people in our lives who have their unhealed wounds are going to inherently act them out on us. So part of that is true. But I think more to the point, I think when we say I'm working as hard as I can to have transition and home be an option, it takes into account that it's a very complex matrix. When I was ready for my son to come home after wilderness and after aftercare, there was some coaching around, I've said this before, where the therapist and the consultant were saying to him after many months of being away, he was 14. He had turned 14 while he was in therapeutic placement. They were saying he's not ready. And eventually my answer was, of course he's not ready. He's 14. I don't expect him to be done, but we're ready. And while 2.5 years later, we contemplated another placement, we turned a corner and he's the one that's 27 going on 28 and thriving in his life in virtually every area of his life, having a meaningful, happy, well-lived life right now. So it's complex. It's a dialogue. It's a discussion. It's a thought process. It reminds me of the quote in The Journey of the Heroic Parent. I think it's on chapter 8 or 10, where I quote Stephen Mitchell. And he says, Dr. Stephen Mitchell says that there's no generic solution or technique. It's a matter of complex self-reflective participation in thought processes. That's why at Evoke, we don't roll out boilerplates, right? I don't have. In fact, when I first did these broadcasts 13 years ago, it'll be 13 years on December 18th. When I first had these broadcasts, I was much more of a boilerplate therapist. I was looking for the bullet points, the things that I think a lot of people look for in self-help posts on social media. And what I learned was it's too complex to boil it down. You can't manualize therapy and self-awareness. It's an evolving, organic process that happens in relationship with another person and in relationship to yourself. So I know that's not a simple answer, but if you were my client or your child was my client in the wilderness and we were talking about it, your question would be welcomed and honored, and then we would have a dialogue about the thought processes. And that would involve me asking you lots of questions about where you were at, and you would arrive at the conclusion yourself, but we would kind of walk through the process together. Sometimes children who do well need longer. Sometimes children who struggle can go home sooner because of this process that I'm describing. So I hope that's okay. Somebody writes, I'm not sure if this is appropriate for the webinar, but what if the client doesn't feel comfortable talking to the therapist? They aren't overly warm. I assume you're describing wilderness therapy. I can't know that for sure. But if you are describing a wilderness therapist, um, the first invitation that I make to clients, really in any context, whether it's outpatient, when they come to our therapy intensives, or whether it's even a young person in a wilderness program, is to talk to your therapist about that. To have a conversation about what's not working for you and how you feel. And for me, that's really the moment when you know if you have an adequate therapist, because an adequate therapist won't make you wrong. They'll be accountable and aware of their shortcomings and be very willing and generous in exploring them. And they'll try to hear you and understand you and offer you what you need. I suppose if you're asking on a really practical level in wilderness, that's where you can ask the clinical director at one of our sites to become involved in the conversation. You talk to the therapist about it. I think one of the most important measures of a therapist's adequacy is to have a conversation with them where you complain to them about them. You share an upset or a frustration, a disappointment, a letdown about them. And if they dive into it like I described, if they're open to it, then you know you have an adequate one. If they're defensive or simply pivot and point out how you're misunderstanding things, then you have somebody who's up against their limitations. So I would encourage the client to talk to the therapist. I would encourage you, the parent, if that's the context, to talk to the therapist. If you want to take it up the chain, talk to the clinical director at one of our two sites right now. That's Lauren Roberts at our Cascades program, or Matt Hoig at our Entrada program, or Travis Slagle at our intensive program. I suppose if you feel like you're getting blocked at that point, you can reach out to me in the process. But I think I said this just to my partners the other day. Clients in every therapeutic context have the right to ask very difficult questions, and they deserve intelligent, thoughtful answers. And if the therapist is burdened or bothered by a client's skepticism or doubt or questioning, then that therapist is, again, up against, extended to the edge of their limits. Their capacity, or lack of it, I should say, is showing itself. Somebody says, can you please clarify and expand on narcissism versus the narcissistic wound? I think I understand each of these, but don't understand how they connect. Is it the same? Is it that the extreme example of a narcissistic wound not being seen in childhood can lead to full-blown diagnosis of narcissism? Gosh, you sound like you're a scholar the way that you asked that question. So you're right. The narcissistic wound, in fact, probably definitely the most listened to podcast in our library this year is the one on the narcissistic wound. In fact, Malia, maybe you could pull that up and share the episode number and maybe even the YouTube channel. So the narcissistic wound is the wound of being missed or not seen or turned into an object. In other words, being valued for your accomplishments, your talents, your successes, right? That's the narcissistic wound, not being seen. Narcissism is a pattern of behaviors that we call personality, where a person's defenses are organized in such a way to either constantly crave situations, feedback, relationships where they're being praised and admired, put on a pedestal. If it's a depressed narcissist, then that there can still be that kind of self-centeredness, but it's all a lot of self-defeating thoughts, a lot of self-hatred, right? You walk into a room and somebody chuckles off in the corner and you assume it's about you. That's a depressed narcissist style. So there's the traditional grandiose narcissist and there's the depressed narcissist. Having said all of that, narcissism as a diagnosis, as a personality disorder, is much more of a continuum. And the narcissistic wound can lead to many different disorders, and everybody has some narcissistic wounding, and everybody has some narcissism. In the disorder, you've crossed a threshold determined by people who determine these things that you qualify for the diagnosis. In other words, the pattern of your narcissistic behavior is so consistent that it becomes rigid, right? Solidified, predictable, right? It kind of crosses over in various contexts and circumstances in your life. So that's the way that you show up. So my podcast where I talk about it is definitely to try to pull us out of this. I'll use another word, another term, this borderline type of thinking where there are simply two piles. The wound is not being seen. The disorder is the way that it manifests. And with the traditional grandiose narcissism, in fact, Alice Miller has a great line that I'll do my best to quote. She says, for the grandiose person to progress, they need to cut the tragic link between praise and self-worth. I've completely butchered that quote, but it's something like that. They have to cut the tie, the tragic link, she calls it, between success, accomplishments, talents, gifts, and love and affection. And when we make the mistake of thinking that admiration is love, we are coming from a narcissistically wounded place, and we are starting to identify with narcissistic personality disorder ideas. Thanks for those links. Somebody writes, in wilderness, clients go cold turkey on dependence on technology as a coping mechanism or type of addiction. How do you prepare them to have a healthier relationship with it after? Is that partially the role of the contained next step, a therapeutic boarding school or a residential treatment center? These questions are like from, you guys are speaking at a high level. You must be students of psychology and self-help. Yes, that's the idea. That wilderness therapy, it's interesting because wilderness therapy is in some ways the easiest place your child will ever be because it's so pure, right? It's an environment that encourages mindfulness. Therapy becomes, besides physical safety, immediate physical safety, therapy is the next priority. And so almost every event, as long as it doesn't risk physical safety, therapy can be had, group can be had, a conversation with a therapeutic staff can be had. So there's quite a drop off, quite a step down from wilderness therapy to home, to most settings at home, right? We call wilderness therapy would fit into a larger umbrella of things we would call primary care and secondary care or extended care or follow-up or aftercare. You know, there's a range of programs. And so part of the model of wilderness therapy is that for some people it can be a restart, it can be a recalibration, it can do a lot, but for a lot of folks there's going to be a step down recommended in between. And yes, then reintegrate. You know, we don't allow for pleasure reading out here for the most part. We don't allow for movie watching. Healthy use of games and electronics is not allowed in wilderness. And so there's a lot of things that we don't do in wilderness that we wouldn't consider inherently toxic or damaging, right? But that's because the focus is so intense, right? The volume is turned up. And so, yes, you're right. That's essentially why this model can be a 2 or a 3-stage model instead of just intervention at home. Although with wraparound aftercare, with intensive outpatient programs at home, with some of the services that people are building around families in communities, we've had more success than we used to 10 years ago, for sure. 10 years ago, it was The percentage of children who went to therapeutic schools and programs was 80 or 90%, and today it's probably about two-thirds. So it's dropped by 10 or 20% in the last 10 years or so. And I think that's because of part of it's because I think of the kind of family work that we do in wilderness. Part of it is I think there are resources at home that are more robust than used to be the case. Somebody writes, my son has had 2 rounds of psychological testing and is being scheduled for a third. Why is it seemingly so difficult to arrive at an accurate diagnosis? I'm not sure. That's if those are spaced out over time, that makes a lot of sense to me. If he had his first round at 8 and his second round at 13, and now he's having another round at 20, having another round could make sense. But that's the exception to the rule if you're talking about them within relatively close proximity, within a couple or few years of each of the testing. So I would ask the same question again. If your psychologist or your therapist gets defensive when you ask questions, you can just notice that their limitations are showing up. But that's a really good question. That's not a typical, if those things are relatively close together and not spaced out over 10, 15 years, that's unusual, I think. Somebody says, is no self-harming, cutting a healthy boundary? It's not that simple. We try to not reduce people and children to their behaviors. We try to see that their behaviors are merely signals. So, I don't have the rule of no self-harming in my family. Because it's a way, it's a way of a child trying to express, act out, communicate their feelings. And so instead, rather than thinking of it as a simple boundary, I would rather get curious about it, listen to it, find out what it means, have it be an entry into a dialogue, a discussion, a therapy. Obviously, the more severe behaviors get, this is across the board. That's why places like Evoke Therapy and Evoke Wilderness programs exist, because it can get to a point, right, where the behavior becomes so acute or threatening that to be curious would be to put somebody at risk. To be simply curious, I should say, would put somebody at risk. So I would, that would not be my first instinct, is to think about no cutting, no self-harm as a boundary. No. But again, as with any symptomatic behavior, if it crosses a threshold where I as a parent become concerned enough, I'm going to escalate behaviors, or excuse me, I'm going to escalate responses that are going to give me a greater sense of safety, for sure. For sure. Somebody wrote, last week we did our fears and insecurities assignment. I was feeling good about how to handle my fears going forward. The next day we got a letter revealing that our son had taken 30 painkillers over the course of a weekend, but we shouldn't worry. He knew what he was doing. How would you coach us in responding to that, especially if this happens at home? I'm not sure that I would tell you not to worry. First of all, ideally, I would never tell you how to feel, right? Ideally, I would want for you to have whatever feeling you have. Now, whether I want you to unload that onto your child is a different conversation. I remember when my son wrote me a letter in the wilderness, he started trying to manage my reaction to it. And I told him I'm just going to have my feelings and have my responses. So again, being curious, listening to him doesn't mean you have to take anyone in your life, including your children, at face value, in the sense that you don't have to do what they say. I would want to know what children are thinking and feeling, but it doesn't mean that I'm going to capitulate necessarily. Um, and that I think that's just him saying that he can't hold your fear. But I would never tell you not to be afraid. If your child took 30 painkillers over a weekend, that would concern me. It's not the question, folks, is never not to be afraid. The question is to work with your fear, to sort it out. The key is you get to feel whatever you feel, but if it's driving you, right, then it's a trauma reaction, a trauma response. But fear is a healthy emotion. And if your fear, your anger, your sadness, your loss becomes overwhelming. Somebody said to me one time, it's the difference between having fear and your fear having you. And I know that's just kind of a metaphor, right? It's just being poetic with the words, but I think you know what that means. And so my response to you is you get to have your reaction, have your boundaries. It's just that you try not to bring your raw fear or anger and work it out with your child. They can't handle that. That's why you have therapists, coaches, mentors, groups that you may go to. You sort it out. I say this all the time. You sort out your raw, intense emotions over there so that when you come back here to work with your child, you're not asking your child to take care of your feelings. But they're informing you for sure. They're encouraging certain behavior and responses for sure. You just want to sort them out enough so that you have some what attachment theorists call response flexibility. In our most heightened, fearful moments, we lose our creativity. We lose our ability to reason. We lose our flexibility. So that's why it's incumbent, it's imperative as a parent, if we want to be more effective, to sort out our fear somewhere, our anxiety somewhere, our anger, frustration somewhere else. Somebody asked the question, what are some typical aftercare programs environments for young adults coming out of wilderness? If a client is in wilderness for anxiety, depression, technology addiction, failure to launch rather than other substance abuses. I haven't listed this in a long time, but there's a host of various programs. There's a podcast and a webinar on aftercare, how to choose the best fit aftercare, where I talk about it, but I really can't get into specific names. It's outside of my purview, especially not knowing your child, and it would take a long time to kind of review all of them. And again, we would have to have a dialogue about that, but there's all kinds of levels of care. So I would talk to your wilderness therapist, talk to your educational consultant for sure. Listen to the broadcast I did on how to choose the best fit aftercare. That might give you at least a starting point about what questions to ask and understanding criteria, understanding features of programs. I'm sorry, I couldn't be more specific. Somebody says, how long do you think it'll be until insurance companies start covering wellness programs? We have, by the way, this is maybe even more important, Malia, to post the link that I did with Joe. I think it was November of 19. It might have been 18, but I think it was November of 19. We also have some resources on our website about this. Insurance companies the answer is they're going to do it as long as they can get away with it. We continue to add to the research. We're starting a new independent research program ourselves and 5 or so other wilderness programs that is run independently, a blind study. So we're trying to make it more and more difficult for them. Several years ago, when the White House administration came up with the Mental Health Parity Act, that put us forward. There's been lawsuits. If you Google There's been lawsuits by individuals where they've won against insurance companies. I've been interviewed. I was interviewed by a couple, one in the Boston Globe, about this very issue. My answer is insurance companies are in the business of making money. That's their job, and so they're going to try to collect as much as they can and pay out as little as they can. And so it's going to take constant effort, not just as a field, but you. And so look at that old broadcast that I did with Joe. Look at the resources on the Evoke website. Um, Denials Management is a company that we recommend, and they are experts at becoming bulldogs for you to be able to kind of fight. Because as Joe said in our broadcast that we shared together, you're going to get rejected. You're going to have to appeal in most cases. It's not going to be handed to you because they can, and because there's a history there. So somebody asked the question, my son knows he needs help, but refuses to attend counseling when I book it. Any advice that would be appreciated? He's still using drug of choice is marijuana. Continue to do your work. You can make therapy or coming with you to therapy a boundary, a rule with consequences. I'm not a big fan of adolescents being forced into outpatient therapy, but I wouldn't say that as a comprehensive rule. But therapy's hard. It's hard to make progress in your life, and it's hard when you're motivated and you're an adult. So when you're an adolescent, with that adolescent brain, it's even harder. My favorite technique is to say, I need you to come to therapy to help me. And then bring your child into family therapy and ask the therapist to help you. Be willing to be on the hot seat. Be willing to be put on the spot. Be willing to see your contribution to the problem. At our intensive program, I don't think I've had an adolescent child attend a family program without a great deal of skepticism and reluctance. And in almost all cases, they've come away feeling very heard and empowered, and have essentially communicated if they knew that it was going to be that good, if they knew they were going to be, that the burden of the family was going to be equally shared, they would have come a long time ago, much with a more eager attitude. They don't want to be the identified patient. So that's my favorite technique, is ask them to come to your therapy. You're allowed to set it as a boundary. I used to think that I have more energy behind that idea. And now I think it depends upon the child. But the answer is keep doing your work. Go to your therapy, go to your meetings. In many cases, in fact, we just had we have our intensive call each week on Wednesday, and I was talking to the staff, and I said, be sure that you consider suggesting to families that want to come to family intensives or couples intensives, to encourage them to go to a Finding You first or instead. It's not always the case that it's better, but often it can be helpful. So doing your work first and foremost it'll change everything. And it's not because you're the sickest one or you're the cause of the problem. It's not because of that. It's because it shifts your relationship to the problem. It's the same thing I talk about in both of my books about it's not a cause and effect relationship, but we so often in couples, we do this. We contribute to the problem that we're complaining about, and we don't know it. I do. It's more common than we can imagine. It's almost consistent across the board. So keep doing your work, invite them in, consider doing more of your work. It's okay to set a boundary, and have those discussions with your therapist. See if this is your issue or not. Somebody writes, my son is probably coming home from an aftercare for a few days for Christmas. The therapist is telling me not to hurry in giving him consequences that I usually do because I'm anxious he won't honor our boundaries and create a connection. How do I do that? Let me read that again so I understand it. My son is probably coming home. I got that. The therapist is telling me to not hurry and giving him consequences that I usually do because I'm anxious he won't honor our boundaries and create a connection. What I imagine is that your therapist is tuning into trying to create some balance. Like I said a few minutes back, that we don't want to reduce children to be their behaviors, but we want to be curious and understand what their behaviors are trying to tell us. Acting out behaviors are kind of a last resort. Martin Luther King said that rioting or violence is the language of the unheard. Same with cutting, substance abuse. So your therapist is suggesting that there's an opportunity for boundaries. There's this kind of curvilinear relationship, right? If you know what a curve looks like, what the standard bell curve looks like, it's kind of like that. Where I think many parents start off unaware, in denial, and then crises emerge, difficulties emerge, and they kind of become more and more aware, and their boundaries become more and more significant. And then on the back end, they kind of leave some wiggle room, right? They've developed some greater capacity and bandwidth. That they start to understand how to roll with failures while still maintaining boundaries. They understand how to let a child trip and fall, but not fall down a flight of stairs. They find some balance. And sometimes the behavior of a parent who's very advanced like that can look like a parent that's in denial, but it's not. One of the things I've talked with parents about over the years, many, many times, is that when therapists are encouraging you to back off, it's not because they're predicting perfect success, but they're trying to help you see the value in the detour, the value in the struggle, the value in the mistake. So if your anxiety is at play and you're trying to control things, like it sounds like the therapist is suggesting, I think they're asking you to kind of increase your bandwidth and see the value in the mistakes and the struggles. That's my best guess based on the information I have from your question. Someone says, how does a therapist work with a client who professes terminal uniqueness? Hopefully they can relate to them. Because I think I think that, well, first of all, I think that that's the most effective way to kind of build trust with the client, is to find how you're the same. I think you can, once you build some trust, you can challenge that without provoking a defense. You can ask questions. You can let them struggle. You can do a lot of things. The cool thing about wilderness therapy is we have a context that is so contained, right, and safe that it does a lot of the work for us. Sometimes peers find a way in or through that defense where authority figures can't or won't or don't. Naming it, relating to it, I think is the key. Teaching about it, understanding it. I think all those things help. When somebody's terminally unique, right? Nobody gets me. I'm the only one like this. I think it's in part a symptom of having not been heard in the past. And so when we're not heard, we tend to exaggerate or exacerbate our description of the problem so that people will finally hear us. So it's about being heard and understood too. So that's the way that you do it. Someone writes, my husband died several years ago after a horrible struggle with alcohol. This will be our third Christmas after his death. My older son returns from a year of treatment, including Evoke, next week. He says holidays no longer matter. I empathize and tend to agree, but his younger brother loves Christmas so much and is looking forward to everything about it. I tend to not push my kids to be something they aren't or don't feel, but before treatment, it meant letting the older son isolate too much. How do I find the middle ground of honoring where my older son is and yet to be a part of a family during a holiday time when we will also be on our own and no other relatives around plus COVID? I mean, I've been asked this question 4 times today in a manner of speaking, not the specifics of your situation, but finding out what you're comfortable with is your life's work. The audacity to be you is to be you. So I don't know how you find that balance. It's you're asking the right question is my answer. It's challenging when we have competing needs in families, in relationships. Some therapists call it that time when people's needs are overlapping and competing, the witching hour, right? Not everybody's needs are going to be met, and so that's the messiness of family, the messiness of holidays. Um, Ask yourself, do some of your own work to find out if your need for him not to isolate during that time is your need and not his. See, when one experiences trauma and then somebody tells them the right way to be, the right way to heal, the right way to respond, we might think that that's coming from a good place, but it's what Jamie Gill calls in one of her books good abuse. Good abuse. It's when the therapist or the parent thinks they know what's better for somebody else and imposes that ideology on top of that person. You can have your boundaries and your limits, but as our bandwidth increases, we allow for differences. We become curious. And when we allow for differences, the person is not being re-injured by the loss of control that occurs when somebody imposes their values on them. It's like, when you're dealing with a child, for example, or an adult who has been sexually abused, you don't out them. You don't demand that they do certain assignments, even though we know that there are certain indicators of progress as somebody heals from therapy assignments. For example, writing a letter to your abuser would be seen by most people as a typical part of a healthy progression from recovery from sexual abuse. But you impose that, you shame that, you demand it, you set expectations around it, and you're re-injuring the individual, because the element that is so consistent in all traumas is a loss of control. So part of the isolation might be the child recapturing some control that the loss of his father took away. Again, very difficult questions, very good questions, very intelligent and thoughtful and deep questions. And it's a work. It's a work. I always get surprised. I told somebody this today. I'm always surprised when I'm talking to people and they're telling me what their spouses, what their spouses, their parents, their children, their relatives are telling them what they should do. And I'll often say to them, it's fascinating to me. I am an expert in behavioral health, and I don't tell you what to do. But these untrained people assume they know other people's truth. And they don't. We don't know what your journey needs to be. We make it our project to discover and understand our own journey, but I don't know what other people's journey needs to be. I need to figure out my journey and my boundaries and what I can and can't tolerate. And none of that involves should and shouldn't. It involves being me. The epigraph of my book says, borrowed from the Letters of Juliet, says, why were each of us taught the notions of being correct when those very notions ensured our failure in the world? The transformation of our work at Evoke Therapy Programs is the transformation from the project of being good and right to the project of being a person. So you have a very human family with unsolvable problems, with grief that can't be compensated for. And if I were your therapist, if I were talking to your family, I would try to understand what each person's needs are and what each person needs to do to take care of themselves. Somebody asked the question, are holiday gifts allowed at Evoke? I thought we were only allowed to give snack items, dried fruit and jerky. Ask your therapist. It can vary from therapist to therapist. You can do sometimes something symbolic, some kind of group toy like a frisbee. I allowed for symbolic, non-expensive gifts that can be shared with the group when I was a wilderness therapist, and we've given our wilderness therapists the leeway. You'll get a letter from the program if you haven't received it yet, but each therapist should let you know what the culture of their group is. Somebody says, my son is angry about something that happened 5 years ago and brought it up again over Thanksgiving. I tried hard to contain him, but still regressed by asking him if he could find any positives in the experience. The period of time he was referring to was also a very difficult time in my life. So it brought up some painful memories for me as well. I ended up excusing myself from the situation, but I'm still feeling unsettled by it. My favorite part of your question or comment is excusing yourself. You can only take what you can take. And your children are our children are bound to find the limitations of our capacity. So we try to listen, we try to contain, but we don't let it come at the cost of who we are fundamentally and what we need. It's just right, it just makes sense. So it's okay to take a step back. It's okay to take a step away. You can only listen to what you. That's why in the Audacity to Be You, I talk about in the first couple of chapters about being you first, finding you first, before I talk about finding and holding space for others. Because I think sometimes in my teaching or in attachment-based therapy, we miss that holding space for other people can only be built if it is to be genuine and real and effective. It can only be built upon the foundation of self, which is our first project. And I said to somebody today, my capacity at 8 o'clock this morning is different than my capacity at 8 o'clock tonight. So your capacity doesn't just change over time, and it does, but it changes moment to moment based on your resources, your energy. My son transitioned from Evoke, somebody says, my son transitioned from Evoke to aftercare 4 weeks ago. I went to visit, and he chose, after an hour of visiting with me, he chose to return to aftercare and not see me for the next 3 days. I returned home. He'll be 18 2 days prior to Christmas. He's adamant he is checking himself out and returning to live with his friends. He is asking to come visit to pick up. He is asking to come visit to pick up his belongings. How do I guide my son to understand why he avoided me on Thanksgiving? I want to give him space and let him show up as he is, but I need both to understand the avoidance to move forward. I hope I didn't mess that up too much. It sounds like you might need something that he's not interested in giving you, is my answer. And our children will do that. Our children don't have to give us what we need. And while under the age of 18, or if we are supporting them and there's kind of a contractual agreement between us and them about the conditions of our support, under 18 and under those conditions, we can set some more stringent parameters and boundaries. But at a certain point, we all hope that our children won't be bound to us at all by those things, right? We hope that love will bind us together, and that means that there's some kind of understanding that we can't control them and we can't get from them what we need just because we need it, even if it's a healthy need. So it's a tough situation. Somebody writes, you mentioned people tend to want to give advice and or soothe their inner child, and I am sure during my work I did just that. I guess I don't understand how you just sit and listen to your inner child, and if you ask them questions, it would make sense the answers come from within, but what if you truly don't have answers? Oh my gosh. It's wonderful not to have answers. Um, it's really wonderful not to have answers. In a sense, not knowing, the beginner's mind, as the Buddhists call it. The therapist who acknowledges that they don't have a solution, the parent who acknowledges, the spouse who acknowledges that they don't have a solution. Not having an answer is a gift. Stick with that. If we could not have answers more, we'd be much more capable of containing or holding space for others. It's very important as parents and therapists and friends and spouses that we don't have answers. And out of the child, out of the other person comes the answer. That's behind the name Evoke therapy, to draw it out. If there's an opening to share stories, examples from your life, how you can relate, similar circumstances where you found something that helped you, which is just a little bit, but enough of a difference from an answer, that's great. Think about 12-step meetings, right? Sharing your own experience, strength, and hope, but not telling somebody what to do or giving them their answer. It's a beautiful place to go and to be, a place that I strive to stay in. Last question. So what is the process to move past being a victim? I don't use that word. I'm not inclined to think of the victim. I think moving past the victim is when you take responsibility for your own life, but the risk is that we get called a victim by other people because of their shame. You know, the mother that allowed her son to blame her for lying, that I share about, she modeled firm and clear boundaries, but empathy for times when she had judged her son, even though he was overtly blaming her for lying. Her boundary did the teaching. Her accountability did the teaching. So if somebody blames me for their circumstances, I just try to listen. My lack of capitulating is the lesson. My saying nothing but understanding the pain, the powerlessness. You know, I've been in situations in my life, many, and some in a very profound way. I've been in situations when it took me many, many years to get out of an unhealthy situation. And because of that, I have patience for other people that are stuck. I tried to earn my way out of the unhealthy relationship. I tried to fight my way out of it. I tried to win my way out of it. I tried to recruit other people so that the other person would change. And I realized at the end of the day that the only person that was going to rescue me was going to be me. And it wasn't easy. And I don't know if being called the victim would have helped. I'm sure it would not have. I probably was called the victim. But victim, the term victim for me is a little bit excuse me, shaming. All right, folks, that's all for tonight. So we'll keep doing these and hopefully they'll catch up. Thank you so much for all your questions and participation. Upcoming Finding Yous, we have them online. Excuse me. We have them online. We also have them in person with COVID testing and some quarantining. They've been very effective. So we have one coming up in January that I will be running. January 6th through 10th is the one that I'm running. I don't run very many of them, so that's one that I'm running. We have an online one January 13th. Got a tickle in my throat. 13th through 15th. Online. Finding You Too, we're planning on April 28th. Email intensives@evoketherapy.com for more information. If you want a pursuits trip for young adults or for families, think adventure therapy, limited programming, sober fun, therapy, reconnect, reach out to Sarah at evoketherapy.com. It also can be something you do in between programs or at the end of a program to kind of have light therapy support and be doing something fun, custom designed all over the world. For parent support groups coming up, December 10th for our wilderness parents at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. And for our intensive alumni, the next one is January 12th at 6 p.m. Malia, I'm going to need a lot of help with my coughs for the podcast this week. Contact Malia at evoketherapy.com for more information or to register. We ask all current parents to go to 6 12-step support groups or refuge recovery or NAMI.org. All of these broadcasts are available on the podcast app, or you can go to soundcloud.com. The name of our podcast is Finding You, an Evoke Therapy podcast. You can find it on any podcast app. On Twitter and Instagram, you can find Evoke Therapy using the handle at Evoke Therapy. And on Instagram, you can find at Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can also find either Evoke Therapy programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. Also go to our blog. Both of my books are available on Amazon, on Audible. The new book, The Audacity to Be You, is one that I just narrated, just came out this month. So thank you for joining me. The next broadcast will be December 14th, chapter 5 in my series on The Audacity to Be You. The name of the chapter, my favorite name for one of the chapters of my books, Marriage, Divorce, and Psychosis. So look forward to that next week, December 14th. Take care, folks. Thanks for joining me this evening. Thanks for on behalf of the people in your life that you love. Thank you for doing your work, because that's like Baba Ram Dass says, the only thing you can do for me is work on you. The only thing I can do for you is work on me. Take care, folks. Have a great week and talk to you next time. Bye-bye.